September 5, 1945. A short man with an ashen face walks out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, Canada. Inside his shirt, pressed against his sweating skin, are 109 classified documents. His hands are trembling. His mouth is bone dry. He has just committed an act that his homeland will consider the ultimate betrayal. His name is Igor Gizenko, and for the next 40 hours he will try desperately to find anyone who will let him defect. Every door he knocks on will close in his face. And when the Soviet secret police finally come for him in the dead of night, the fate of the Cold War will hang on whether one man can convince the West of an impossible truth. Their ally has been their enemy all along. This is the story of how the most secure cryptographic system ever devised, a code that was mathematically proven to be unbreakable, was broken anyway. Not by superior mathematics, not by captured equipment, not by brilliant deduction alone, but by something the code makers never anticipated. Human imperfection, bureaucratic carelessness, and one terrified clerk who understood that some secrets are too dangerous to keep. The world in August 1945 was celebrating. American and Soviet soldiers had embraced at the Elbe River. The United Nations was being born. Victory parades filled the streets. In Canada, Prime Minister Mackenzie King was championing Soviet-Canadian friendship. The war was over. The age of cooperation had begun. But in the cipher rooms, those windowless chambers where men like Gizenko worked, a different reality existed. Here, words became numbers, numbers became groups, and those groups became messages that traveled as invisible radio waves or through cables beneath the ocean. And somewhere on the other end, someone was always trying desperately to read them. Igor Gizenko was 26 years old, a code clerk working for the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. His job was mechanical, precise, and absolutely critical. Colonel Nikolai Zabatin, the resident head of the GRU in Ottawa, would hand him messages. Gizenko would encode them using a system called a one-time pad, theoretically the most secure cipher in existence, and transmit them to Moscow. The one-time pad system was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its effectiveness. Each pad contained pages of random 5-digit groups. You would take your message, convert it to code using a codebook, then add the random numbers from the pad. The mathematics were ironclad. If each page was truly used only once and then destroyed, the system was literally unbreakable. Not difficult to break. Not challenging to break. Mathematically, provably, absolutely impossible to break. But Gizenko had noticed something over his months in Ottawa. The same organization that demanded perfect secrecy was also demanding something impossible: the betrayal of the nation that hosted them. For months, Gizenko had been reading the traffic he was encoding. Reports from Canadian scientists working on atomic energy. Intelligence from officials in the Canadian government. Information from a member of parliament. Names, dates, technical specifications, all flowing back to Moscow in an endless stream of encrypted betrayal. And as he prepared those messages for transmission, as he carefully added the additive key from his one-time pads, he began to make another calculation entirely. Gizenko had a pregnant wife, a young son, and he had been called back to Moscow. In Stalin's Soviet Union, such recalls were often one-way trips. People who knew too much had a habit of disappearing. So he began selecting cables, 109 of them, that he felt sure would buy him and his family a permanent home in the West. Documents that would prove beyond any doubt that the Soviets had been running a massive espionage operation against their wartime allies. On that September night he made his move. What happened next would be almost comical if it weren't so terrifying. Gizenko went to the Ottawa Journal newspaper. Not interested. He went to the Minister of Justice. Unavailable. The Crown Attorney's office. Unable to help. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They suggested he come back during business hours. For 40 hours, this desperate man trudged through the late summer heat, trying to find someone to defect to. The problem wasn't just his broken English or his nervous manner. The problem was that what he was saying required standing the entire world of 1945 on its head. The Russians were allies, friends, partners in victory. The idea that they were running a massive espionage network, that they had penetrated the highest levels of Canadian government, that they were stealing atomic secrets, it was unthinkable. It was like claiming the sky was green or water flowed uphill. By the evening of September 6th, exhausted, knowing the embassy would have discovered his absence and the missing documents, Gizenko returned to his apartment with his family. They sat in tense silence, the weight of their decision crushing down on them. Then came a furious pounding on the door. A Russian voice shouted his name. Gouzenko recognized it immediately. It was Zabudin's driver. The man pounded for what seemed like hours, then left. At 10 o'clock, 4 men from the embassy returned. This time they brought an officer of the NKVD, the Soviet State Security Service. A neighbor had offered to hide the Gouzenkos. From across the hall, they watched through a crack in the door as the Soviets smashed down their apartment door. They heard Russian voices, angry and searching. They heard their furniture being overturned, their possessions being destroyed. When local police finally arrived, the NKVD officer claimed diplomatic immunity. He declared the apartment Soviet property. He tried to order the police away. For a moment, on a quiet residential street in Ottawa, the Cold War nearly turned hot. Then the NKVD officer led his men away into the night. The next morning, everything changed. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police took the Gouzenkos into protective custody and drove them 90 miles from Ottawa to a small, isolated lakeside summer cabin. Here, Igor Gouzenko's months-long debriefing began. And here, the West got its first real look at what the Soviets had been doing while they smiled and shook hands in public. The 109 cables Gouzenko had stolen were a Rosetta Stone of betrayal. They revealed a spy network that extended into Canadian government departments, the British High Commission, and most explosively, the atomic bomb program. Among the scientists directly implicated was Alan Nunn-May, a physicist working on a large heavy water reactor at Chalk River, north of the Canadian capital. Nunn-May also served on 2 Canadian government committees that gave him access to the highest-level atomic secrets. One of Gouzenko's cables contained a long report written by Nunn-May describing the entire organization of the Manhattan Project, including the work being done to produce weapons-grade uranium-235 and plutonium at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, complete with the names of scientists who headed each section. Another cable revealed that Nunn-May had given the Russians a 10-page, single-spaced typewritten technical report on the bomb project, plus something even more shocking. A microgram sample of uranium-233, a rarer isotope that American scientists believed might offer an easier pathway to producing weapons material. Prime Minister Mackenzie King wrote in his diary about the shock he felt when confronted with the truth of Gouzenko's claims. He wrote, "I think of the Russian embassy being only a few doors away and of them being a center of intrigue. During this period of war, while Canada has been helping Russia and doing all we can to foment Canadian-Russian friendship, there has been one branch of the Russian service that has been spying on us. The amazing thing is how many contacts have been successfully made with people in key positions in government and industrial circles." On September 25, 1945, an early visitor arrived at Gouzenko's lakeside cabin. His name was Frank Rowlett, and he was an expert in what was delicately called crypto matters. The British had asked the Canadians if an American cryptologic expert could interview the Soviet defector. Rowlett left Washington with 2 days' notice, driven to the secret location by an RCMP inspector and a Canadian mathematician. Rowlett was one of the small group of Americans who understood the hidden architecture of secret communications. He had been there at the beginning of American cryptanalysis, working with William Friedman to break the Japanese purple cipher. He knew what to look for. What Gouzenko could tell him seemed, at first, discouraging. The diplomatic traffic was enciphered entirely with one-time pads, each containing 55 number groups. Used correctly, this system was unbreakable. But Rowlett understood something crucial. Systems aren't broken by their mathematics. They're broken by their implementation. By human error. By the gap between perfect theory and imperfect practice. And Gouzenko was giving him clues, small details that might open doors. The GRU's codebook, Gouzenko explained, was what cryptanalysts called a one-part code. The words in the codebook were arranged in alphabetical order and simply assigned ascending numerical codes from beginning to end. This design choice made logistics easier for the code makers. They only needed one book instead of 2. But for codebreakers it was a gift. If you knew 2 code groups and their meanings, you could guess where unknown groups fell in the alphabet. If you knew that 2451 meant airplane and 2890 meant artillery, then 2670 probably represented something alphabetically between those 2 words. But Gouzenko revealed something even more valuable. There was a special system, a code table within the code, used to spell out words using Latin or Cyrillic letters. This was needed whenever a foreign word or a Russian word without its own code group needed to be transmitted. The special code group 7810 indicated begin spell. The two-digit group 91 indicated the end. Within the spelled-out section, the numerical code groups stood for individual letters rather than words. And here was the weakness. Any spelled-out section, once the additive was removed, was essentially a simple substitution cipher. The same numeral always stood for the same letter. And simple substitution ciphers are vulnerable to the oldest cryptanalytic attack in existence: frequency analysis. In every language, certain letters appear far more frequently than others. In English, E appears about 12% of the time. Z appears about 0.3%. By counting how often each symbol appears, you can guess which symbols represent which letters. Rowlett returned to Washington without any breakthroughs to report. But he carried something more valuable than solutions. He carried the small details that make solutions possible. Arlington Hall, Virginia. A former girls' school, now transformed into the nerve center of American code breaking. Here, in rooms that once held chemistry labs and music classes, hundreds of analysts worked on the Soviet diplomatic codes. The work had been going on since 1943, when the Army Signal Intelligence Service had assigned a small team to tackle Soviet communications. Progress had been glacial. The one-time pad system, used correctly, was impenetrable. But the Soviets hadn't used it correctly. Multiple pages of duplicate key had been issued by the Russians to users of various one-time pad systems. Sometimes the same page appeared in two different pads within the same system. Sometimes a page from one system showed up in another system entirely. When two messages used the same one-time pad page, cryptanalysts called it a depth. And depths were exploitable. The mathematics is elegant in its simplicity. If message A plus key equals encrypted message A, and message B plus the same key equals encrypted message B, then encrypted message A minus encrypted message B equals message A minus message B. The key cancels out entirely. Of course, you still don't know what either message says. But now you're working with something much weaker than a one-time pad. You're working with a double encoded message where patterns can emerge, where frequencies can be analyzed, where educated guesses can be tested. In May 1945, an analyst named Cecil Phillips made an astonishing discovery. Some Russian code clerks, when they had long messages to encipher, had adopted an insecure shortcut. They would use a page of key in normal fashion for the first 50 groups, then use the same key page in reverse order for the next 50 groups. A search for these reverse depths eventually yielded 4,000 examples. A dozen staffers were assigned just to this task. Most of these reverse depths appeared in trade messages, reports of goods being shipped under Lend-Lease. The intelligence value was minimal. But for cryptanalysis they were gold. Professor Samuel Chu from the University of Oklahoma made another crucial breakthrough in April 1945. He discovered that the trade messages followed stereotyped formats, rigid structures with number-laden lists of commodities and shipping quantities. Stereotyped content is a codebreaker's dream. If you know a message probably starts with report on shipment of or contains predictable phrases like quantity delivered or destination confirmed, you can make educated guesses about what code groups mean. Each correct guess unlocks more guesses. Each verification confirms more code groups. By early 1946, Arlington Hall's Russian section had recovered about 15,000 groups of additive key and identified approximately 2,000 possible code groups in the codebook they had designated Jade. But half of those were considered doubtful, and only 20 had been assigned even tentative meanings. If the standard work of a codebreaker was finding a needle in a haystack, the Russian problem required finding a wisp of straw in a haystack. The conventional wisdom among cryptanalysts had been that you needed multiple sets of overlapping messages, depths of 3 or more, to break an enciphered code. Arlington Hall's Russian section was proving that wrong, working entirely from depths of 2. But it was agonizingly slow work. Over the following months, they added only about 10 code groups per month to the list of known words. Then everything changed. In January 1946, a linguist named Meredith Gardner joined the Russian section as its chief book breaker, the person whose job was to work out code group meanings. Gardner was a shy, slender, self-effacing scholar. He had been teaching Spanish and German at the University of Akron. He had a master's degree in German from the University of Texas, where he had learned Russian by taking lessons from the Russian-born grandmother of a fellow student. Along the way he had picked up Bulgarian, Hebrew, Lithuanian, and several other languages through his own studies. After being sidetracked for part of 1946 to work on Bulgarian diplomatic traffic, Gardner returned to Arlington Hall's Russian section on November 4. Over the next 2 weeks, he added 86 new recoveries to the Jade codebook, nearly doubling the number of known code group meanings from about 100 to 200. Then, on December 13, Gardner broke the Jade codebook spell table. The message was from 1944 and quoted a lengthy report in English. The message itself was of no intelligence value. It consisted of predictions on the likely outcome of the U.S. presidential election. But embedded within it were long stretches of spelled-out words, protected only by simple letter-for-number substitution within the spell table. Gardner applied classical frequency analysis. In the spelled-out sections, certain number groups appeared far more often than others. Those would represent common letters, E, T, A, O, I, N. By testing combinations, by looking for common words and patterns, by exploiting his knowledge of multiple languages and their characteristic structures, Gardner cracked the spell table. It was like finding the key to a safe within a safe. The outer safe, the one-time pad, was still theoretically secure. But wherever the Soviets had used the spell table, wherever they had spelled out names or foreign words or technical terms that weren't in their codebook, Gardner could now read them. A week later, on December 20th, Gardner broke part of another message from 1944. This one contained large stretches of spelled-out words. As Gardner worked through the decryption, letter by letter, names began to emerge. Hans Bethe, Niels Bohr, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, Emilio Segre, Arthur Compton, Ernest Lawrence, Harold Urey. They were all leading scientists, and in 1944, they were all working on a project so secret that even its name was classified. The Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. The message stated clearly, these were scientists who are working on the problem. In 1944, that was top-secret information. The Soviets weren't supposed to know these names. They weren't supposed to know about the Manhattan Project at all. It was the first substantial result from 3 years of work on the Soviet diplomatic codes. And it revealed something shocking. The traffic Gardner was reading wasn't handling ordinary diplomatic messages from ambassadors and consular staff. It was the primary communication channel for spies of the NKGB, Soviet Foreign Intelligence, later to become the KGB. These encrypted telegrams, sent under diplomatic cover, were how Soviet agents in the West received instructions from Moscow and filed their intelligence reports back. And now, for the first time, the West could read them. Standing over Gardner's shoulder as he decoded the atomic scientist message was a co-worker named William Weisband. He was a linguist advisor to the project, a friendly and naturally gregarious man who moved easily around Arlington Hall. Weisband was always mysterious about what he called his exotic background. He knew Russian fluently and could read and speak Arabic. He spoke English with barely a discernible accent, had served in the U.S. Army as a translator and cryptologist in North Africa and Italy. Gardner didn't think anything of it at the time that Weisband was the first person to learn of his break into the Soviet espionage traffic. He should have. On February 3, 1946, the American newspaper columnist Drew Pearson broke the story of Gouzenko's defection in his radio broadcast. Prime Minister Mackenzie King, still fearful of provoking a breach with the Soviets but now forced to act, authorized arrests. Alan Nunn May and about 20 others implicated in Gouzenko's cables were arrested. Like nearly all the Western scientists who would be revealed to have engaged in espionage for the Russians, Nunn May was an idealistic communist who believed he was advancing world peace by sharing atomic secrets. He would later explain, "The whole affair was extremely painful to me, and I only embarked on it because I felt this was a contribution I could make to the safety of mankind. I certainly did not do it for gain." But his idealism had consequences. The secrets he passed helped accelerate the Soviet atomic bomb program by years. The delicate balance of nuclear deterrence that would define the Cold War, mutually assured destruction, the theory that peace could be maintained through the threat of annihilation, came sooner and more dangerously than it might have otherwise. The Gouzenko affair transformed how the West viewed the Soviet Union. The alliance that had won World War II was revealed to have been hollow at its core. While Soviet soldiers fought and died alongside Western troops, Soviet intelligence officers were stealing their allies' deepest secrets. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would soon call it, had actually descended years before anyone in the West had realized it was falling. But the Gouzenko revelations and Gardner's breakthroughs were only part of a larger story, one that stretched across the ruins of Nazi Germany and into the technical laboratories where the Germans had been fighting their own secret war against Soviet codes. In 1944, even before the war ended, British and American intelligence had begun planning special missions with an opaque code name: TICOM, Target Intelligence Committee. The goal was to locate and seize German signals intelligence equipment, records, and personnel before the Soviets got to them. Among those assigned to TICOM Team 1 were Art Levinson, a math major from City College who had worked on Enigma at Bletchley Park, and Navy Lieutenant Commander Howard Campagny, a mathematics professor from the University of Minnesota. Their adventure was frequently surreal. They picked through Hitler's villa at Berchtesgaden. They navigated blown bridges and suspicious occupation forces. They followed fragmented leads that often went nowhere. Then, on May 21, 1945, Campagny received a crucial tip. The U.S. 7th Army was holding a prisoner at Bad Aibling who claimed he had worked on intercepting and decoding Russian radio teleprinter traffic. His name was Unteroffizier Dietrich Suschauck. He and 19 other men had buried their equipment and documents at a barracks in nearby Rosenheim. The next day, Campagny collected the prisoners, drove them to the site and set them to work digging. 8 tons of cryptanalytic secrets emerged from the German hiding place. And the German soldiers, viewing themselves not as defeated enemies but as fellow specialists with genuine pride in their technical work, eagerly offered to reassemble their equipment and demonstrate how it worked. Their prized piece of apparatus was called the Hartmar-Fach-Fernschreiber, mercifully shortened to HMFS. It was a demultiplexing receiver that could separate 2 to 9 multiplex channels from a single radio signal. It represented extremely sophisticated engineering: oscilloscopes for synchronization, automatic locking circuits, relay-based memory buffers. By June 29, 6 of the German prisoners and their equipment had been brought to England. Within 24 hours of arrival, they had one of the HMFS units assembled and working. The following day, 50 teleprinters were churning out streams of intercepted Russian signals. What the Germans had discovered, and what the Americans and British now possessed, was the key to reading Soviet military teleprinter traffic. The Russians were using an online cipher device similar to the German Lorenz machine that Bletchley Park had famously broken. The device used banks of cipher wheels to generate continually changing key that was automatically added to each character as it was transmitted. The Germans called it the bandworm, the tapeworm. The British and Americans would call it caviar, then later Longfellow. One German prisoner, Unteroffizier Erich Karenberg, proved particularly valuable. The son of a German manufacturer who had grown up in Russia, Karenberg was a concert pianist and lecturer who spoke Russian fluently and had a thoroughly mathematical mind. His detailed reports on Russian procedures revealed critical vulnerabilities. Russian operators were often extremely careless. They would give away message starting positions during unenciphered preliminary chats. They would include standard preambles and addresses within the enciphered portions, creating predictable stereotyped openings. Transmitters and receivers would get out of sync, requiring messages to be resent, creating large amounts of duplicated plaintext. Even without fully reconstructing the machine's wheel patterns, the Germans had been able to decode paired messages they knew were in depth. They had read Red Army reports from front headquarters to Moscow, orders concerning officer transfers and promotions, signals intelligence and prisoner interrogation reports. The Americans and British launched their own concerted effort to exploit this intelligence. The goal was to recover long stretches of key, deduce the wheel patterns, reconstruct the device's key generation algorithm, and then, with powerful enough computing machinery, read any message, not just the small percentage that happened to be in depth. But the work went slowly. There was never enough traffic to analyze, never enough personnel assigned, never enough computing power available. The Army temporarily put the project on hold. The Navy borrowed 1 or 2 officers from other sections, then by August 1946 had abandoned it as well due to lack of personnel. Plans were drawn up for an ambitious superbomb called Hiawatha, a computer with 40,000 vacuum tubes, twice as many as any existing digital computer, projected to cost $1 million. It would be able to statistically match each message with its encipherment key, allowing continuous reading of traffic. The project faced repeated delays. Then, just months before Hiawatha was finally approved in late 1947, the Soviets abruptly stopped using the Longfellow system. Howard Campagny, who had helped capture the German equipment at Rosenheim, wrote in disgust that if the traffic had been fully collected from when it first appeared in 1943, the system probably would have been solved in 1945. The entire story is one of too little too late. This system was in use for 5 years, yet we were not ready to read it in quantity until it disappeared. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout the early Cold War. The wartime signals intelligence agencies had run on improvisation, inspiration, and adrenaline. Young mathematicians and linguists worked side by side with no regard for rank or hierarchy. Getting the job done was what mattered. But peace brought demobilization. Arlington Hall's civilian workforce dropped from thousands to just over 2,000 by the summer of 1946. Many of the brilliant minds who had won the cryptologic war were gone, back to their universities and law practices and pre-war lives. The agencies adopted new, deliberately vague names. The Army's Signal Intelligence Service became the Army Security Agency. The Navy's OP-20G became Communications Supplementary Activities, Washington. The British Government Code and Cipher School became Government Communications Headquarters. A new code word appeared on their most sensitive material. CREAM, standing for Special Intelligence, information that resulted from the decryption of encrypted communications. The aim was to restrict dissemination within the narrowest possible limits. As one order explained, disclosure of CREAM material caused a twofold embarrassment to the U.S. government: operational and loss of intelligence, and political. The very existence of government bureaus intercepting and decoding communications in peacetime was legally and morally murky. The Federal Communications Act of 1934 made it a federal crime to divulge intercepted communications to third parties. Yet the cable companies continued their wartime cooperation, allowing Army officers in civilian clothes to pick up copies of all international telegrams. When the company presidents sought assurances that they wouldn't face prosecution, they were told the program was essential to national security. But putting it on solid legal footing would risk exposure itself. A plan to submit formal legislation was abandoned after lawyers warned about embarrassing lines of questions and ill-advised screams about press freedom and civil rights. The question of legality retreated into murky shadows, where it would fester for another 3 decades. Remember William Weisband, the friendly linguist who was the first person to see Meredith Gardner's breakthrough into Soviet espionage traffic? In the years that followed, Weisband seemed to be everywhere at Arlington Hall. He was naturally gregarious, helpful, interested in everyone's work. He moved easily between sections, asking questions, offering assistance, learning what progress was being made. His exotic background remained mysterious. Where exactly had he learned his fluent Russian? Why was he so skilled with cryptologic work? Why had someone with his linguistic gifts and technical knowledge ended up in exactly the right place at exactly the right time? The truth would only emerge years later. William Weisband was a Soviet agent. Everything the Americans discovered about Soviet codes, every breakthrough Gardner made, every vulnerability the TICOM teams uncovered, all of it was being reported back to Moscow. Which explains why, again and again, just as American and British cryptanalysts were on the verge of success, Soviet cipher systems would suddenly change. Traffic would disappear. New procedures would be implemented. It was as if the Soviets knew exactly when they were becoming vulnerable. They did know. Weisband was telling them. The story that began with Igor Gizenko's desperate 40-hour search for someone to defect to would shape the next half-century of history. It revealed that the Cold War hadn't begun when Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech in 1946, or when the Berlin blockade started in 1948. It had been underway since at least 1943, hidden beneath the surface of wartime alliance. The cables Gizenko carried out of the Soviet embassy that September night proved that one-time pads, theoretically unbreakable, could be broken when human beings implemented them imperfectly. They proved that depths of 2 were exploitable. They proved that stereotyped content and spelling systems created vulnerabilities. They proved that even the most secure codes contained patterns and patterns could be found. The lessons learned at Arlington Hall in those early post-war years, about the gap between cryptographic theory and operational reality, about the importance of collecting all available traffic even when you can't read it yet, about the need for massive computational power to exploit discovered vulnerabilities, would echo through the development of modern signals intelligence. Today's encryption systems are vastly more sophisticated than one-time pads. But the fundamental principles remain the same. Mathematical security means nothing if implementation is flawed. Human error creates exploitable patterns. Side channels leak information. And somewhere, patient analysts are looking for the gaps between theory and practice. It all started with one terrified man, carrying 109 cables stuffed inside his shirt, trying to find someone who would believe the unbelievable. For 40 hours, Igor Gizenko stood at the threshold between two worlds, the world that was ending and the world that was beginning, the world of wartime alliance and the world of Cold War suspicion, the world of secrets kept and the world of secrets revealed. When the sun rose on September 7, 1945, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police finally took the Gizenkos into protective custody, the man who had spent his professional life creating unbreakable codes had done something far more difficult. He had broken the illusion that allies always remain allies, that shared enemies create permanent friends, that the visible war was the only war being fought. And 16 months later, when Meredith Gardner decoded those names, Beta, Bohr, Teller, Fermi, he confirmed what Gizenko had risked everything to reveal. Beneath the surface of every alliance, every treaty, every diplomatic courtesy, there runs a hidden war of codes and secrets, of messages encrypted and messages decrypted, of information protected and information stolen. That war continues today. The methods have changed, computer algorithms instead of code books, fiber optic cables instead of radio waves, quantum encryption instead of one-time pads. But the fundamental struggle remains the same. The endless contest between those who keep secrets and those who break them. And the fundamental paradox remains unsolved. How do democracies maintain the secret capabilities necessary to protect themselves, without the excessive secrecy that ultimately undermines democratic accountability? How much transparency can we afford? How much secrecy can we tolerate? Igor Gizenko carried 109 answers out of the Soviet embassy that September night. They raised 10,000 questions we're still trying to answer. In cryptography, they say that a one-time pad properly used is mathematically unbreakable. But history proved otherwise. Not because the mathematics was wrong, but because humans are imperfect, patterns emerge, and someone, somewhere, is always watching for the gap between what should be secure and what actually is. The unbreakable codes were broken. The impossible secrets were revealed. And one terrified Soviet clerk, turned away from 40 hours of doors, changed the world by refusing to stop knocking.